Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the series of webinars exploring leading in extraordinary times, brought to you by the Side Business School at the University of Oxford. I'm Jonathan Reynolds. I'm an associate professor in retail marketing at the school, where I'm also the director of our Institute of Retail Management. I've been writing and researching about retailing for over 30 years. Today's webinar is aimed at exploring some of the really extraordinary challenges that have been facing this particular sector internationally. Now, it would be hard not to be aware, I guess, of some of the transformational changes that have already been affecting retailing worldwide over the past few years, even in business as usual times. Just a few of these, the power of technological change in the hands of shoppers, the growth of online retailing, digital platforms as part of that, the rise of new kinds of enterprises calling themselves retailers, the growth of a wholly new consumer culture in parts of the world, many geographies. These drivers have already led to a whole range of impacts, the failures of some traditional kinds of retail business models, store closures, and a much reduced physical footprint for the sector in many markets. But the current crisis has created, I think, an even more perfect storm, and with some remarkable features. We can just think of a few of these from our own experience. The complete lockdown of non-essential store-based retailing for months in many markets, frenzied stockpiling behavior by consumers, the fact that despite seeing accelerated growth in online buying, we also saw the emergence of the most bizarre thing of queues online to even get onto retail websites or to book delivery slots. Last but by no means least, and perhaps the recognition that is overdue, of the grocery retail workforce as key workers in contemporary society. Of course, we're all living through and experiencing this at the moment in our various ways across the world. And it's clear that we're emerging into a very different set of economic circumstances and social circumstances from those from just a few short weeks ago. And so I want to use this webinar as a way of casting our thoughts forward to what the retail landscape may look like post-COVID. To help me in that conversation, I'm really delighted to be joined by, first, Helen Dickinson, OBE. Helen is Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium and leads a UK trade organisation that's charged, amongst other things, with supporting retailers seeking to plan for the future in these extraordinarily difficult times. I'm also joined by Dr. Alan Tregold. Alan is a retail sector advisor with over 20 years experience internationally. He's been head of retail at Leo Burnett, as well as partner and global head of retail for PA Consulting. He's also co-author with me, if I can do a bit of prompting, of a guide to navigating the new retail landscape. Fortunately, the new edition is due out later.
It requires a rewrite.
That's the end of our promotional push on this. Rather worryingly, between us, we seem to have over 75 years experience in working with the sector worldwide. So welcome both of you to this conversation. And we'll be interested too in your questions from the audience, your questions and observations. What would you like to ask the panel? Please post your questions, whatever platform you happen to be using, and we'll make sure that we have time at the end to try and respond to as many as we can. I'm going to start by asking both of our guests to make some initial observations about the situation. Now, we're in the middle of the Oxford exam season, even though it's probably an exam season that we've never seen its like before. It's entirely online with take-home exams and so on. That's no excuse for not trying hard under exam conditions. And so I was prompted to create a classic Oxford exam-style question to kick us off. And that an exam-style question, I suppose, is where these are questions to which the answer is not always the obvious one. That's the hint. Okay. So let me ask you both to consider this. It's been suggested that retailing will never be the same again. Do you agree? And let me start with Helen, perhaps, to kick this off.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just to put a context to my remarks, so the BRC is the lead trade association for the retail industry in the UK. And our mission talks about making a positive difference for the industry, both today and in the future. And I think the word future is absolutely critical at the current moment, given we all as individuals and the industry itself faces down coronavirus. And as you highlighted there, I think we are absolutely at a real crucial moment for the industry. And I don't know if you can have a thing that's more perfect than a perfect storm, but there's no doubt that that the virus has been a massive shock and potentially presents an existential threat to certain parts of the retail industry, depending on how both retailers and governments and members of the public respond over the coming weeks and the months. And certainly from a food industry point of view, we've had the supply chains, the resilience, the people who work in the food industry absolutely being tested to the limits by huge peaks in demand right across the world in the lead up to the various lockdown situations. And we've had, certainly in the UK, and I know it's different in different markets, online remaining open and being a lifeline, if you like, for so many of us in our sort of new forced different lifestyles. And yet for many retail businesses, their demand has been cut off completely with the closure of large swathes of stores. And this will be pretty similar, I'm sure, across all markets, but we've seen the largest fall in retail sales, pretty much since anybody's ever started collecting records. And I think, the question for lots of us, particularly in different parts of the sector, and it comes back to your question really, is, that there will potentially be many retail businesses that were perfectly healthy before all this happened that may not survive and come out the other side. And we were, as you said, facing into already a transformation, fewer stores, the evolving role of store, growth of online, greater connectivity of physical and digital retailing, and already seeing fewer jobs in the industry. Certainly in the UK, there were nearly 100,000 fewer people in retail in 2019. And a shifting sort of nature of the world of work, better paid jobs, more digital, more analytical jobs, but potentially fewer of them. And certainly, I think, as we look forward, there is no way that anybody that I'm speaking to, and I'd be interested in perspectives from a broader international point of view, that is expecting demand to return to pre-crisis levels as like a tap that gets turned back on when the restrictions lift. And that's basically because not only we will be facing a more sort of stringent economic outlook, but also we've got the practicalities of constrained supply just because of social distancing and everything that sits around it. And I think that, how much the industry will change will really depend a lot on the responses from here of many governments and the interventions that they make. We have seen, certainly from a UK point of view, some real significant interventions around job support schemes, and I know that's very similar to what has happened in other markets. But we could argue that actually is has just been a sort of temporary delay mechanism, if you like, because actually, pretty much without exception, what we are absolutely seeing is that the pace of change, the acceleration of many, but not all, of the trends that we were seeing before has quickened to an exponential degree, such that, take something like food online retailing. It was hovering about sort of 6 or 7% in the UK of total retail sales. That has grown by 20 or 30% over the course of the last 8 or 9 weeks. That sort of change from a business point of view would have potentially taken years for them to work out how to do. And actually an emergency situation has caused a real mindset shift. So I do not think that the industry is going to be the same again, in answer to your question, but it never was. We were already on a transformation journey. And I think part of what we are going to see play out is some of those trends will continue, but not necessarily all of them. And the whole question about how you implement sort of the experience associated with physical retailing in a socially distanced world, I think is one of the biggest question marks. But I say my answer to your question is it never was, and it won't be the same again, because it wouldn't have been anyway. It'll just be even more different than before.
That's a nice twist. You get an alpha plus for that answer, so well done. Thank you. Alan, would you care? There's lots in there to drill into, and we will do that. But Alan, would you care to offer your initial observations on this?
I will. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for the opportunity. I find that it's difficult, I think, to be definitive about the outlook for the sector in an environment that is just defined by absolutely extreme uncertainty. And the uncertainties that the industry faces are clearly uncertainties way beyond the confines of any one sector, including retail. And there are uncertainties around the outlook for the virus, and particularly the health impacts, and whether a vaccine will be found, will be effective, which presents a lot of different scenarios. The positive scenario that this becomes a version of a seasonal flu, the alternative extreme that this becomes as having to be used to living in a world of periodic tightenings, periodic liberalizations. There's tremendous economic uncertainty, obviously, for the sector and well beyond retail. And I think it's uncertainty around the depth of recession, the duration of recession, the impacts of recession, but accepting that there are going to be major adverse economic headwinds for a very long time to come. I think also there's great uncertainty that the sector faces around the international environment. And one of the defining themes of the global response to the virus has been that, of course, it's been largely not coordinated, and it's been very often a competition, what appears to be a competition between national regulators. And I think there must be concern about the future for a joined up international world in what feels now like a very fragmented world, both economically and politically. And then, as Helen was exploring, there are clearly uncertainties a little bit closer to home for retailers around the consumer spending landscape. But of course, that is going to be, I think, as much to do with lifestyle change as much as it is to do with purchase consumption behavior. But of course, what business leaders need to do is to narrow the range of certainty, of uncertainty, and therefore have more certainty around the future environment. And I think actually it is possible to put some stakes in the ground as regards the impact of the virus on the retail industry. And certainly I would envisage that a lot of those efforts by retailers to realise e-commerce opportunities, to turn their businesses into more digitally enabled organisations that really better reflect the way that a lot of consumers want to live their lives and conduct their purchases. I think a lot of those efforts before the virus were at best partial in their scope, and they were at best partial in their execution. But I think that this is going to be one of those areas that will receive a great deal more attention and is going to become much more an essential component of just doing business. I feel that related to that, when I think about the pre-virus world, there was a lot of discussion in the global retail industry around notions of frictionless shopping, ease for the consumer to move across multiple channels. But I think that looking forward, the notion of contactless shopping is going to be a hugely important dimension of this frictionless aspiration. And again, my belief is that for many retailers, that will simply become a necessary part of how they conduct their operations. I feel also, to the real estate point, that it's very difficult to anticipate a future that doesn't involve a lot of exiting of retail real estate. And I think that we've seen in the recent past, when I hear colleagues in the US talking about a future that envisages vacancy rates in premium shopping centres of 25%, in less premium shopping centres of 25 to 50%. Well, if you've got those levels of vacancies, you don't have viable shopping centres, and clearly the knock-on implications for landlords are profound, and also the appetite for investors to invest in the retail and retail property sectors are profound. And to that point of appetite for investors to support the sector, I think it's been generally low for a number of years, and I think it's very low now. And during the crisis and immediately before the crisis, we saw a lot of very well-established retail names filing for their local version of bankruptcy protection. You know, it was Neiman's in JCPenney in the US, it's been Debenhams in the UK. We've seen other retailers like Macy's and Gap having their debt written down to essentially junk status, which tells you a lot about the lack of appetite and belief in even very large retail businesses. And I think we do have to expect that there is going to be more fallout in that regard. And I think that consumer change in shopping behaviour as a consequence of very significant changes in lifestyle and in work style adds to this sense of uncertainty in the sector. Do I think, to the exam question, do I think those trends add up to a retail never being the same outlook? Yes, I think they probably do. And I think the reason why they do is because what we're talking about in this virus is a global change to the system of retail and a systemic change across the total value chain, from where the product comes from to how the product or service is delivered to the customer. So collectively, yes, I do think that this is a profound period of change for the industry.
Thanks, Alan. That's a really full reply. And I think we want to try and unpack some of the issues that you both mentioned. You both mentioned quite big, kind of scary words: existential, systemic. Thinking about the change in the whole ecosystem. What I wanted to do was to try and give credit to what you've been talking about, but actually be a bit more structured in what we now go on to discuss. And I thought we might focus on kind of 4 areas. Thinking a bit about, first of all, the consumer. Second, around the kind of response in terms of retail business models. Thirdly, around some of the issues that both of you raised around the role of government and the role of globalization or deglobalization. And fourthly, given that this series is around leadership, what the implications are for retail leaders. But it seems to me the clear place to start, as all retailers do, is with the focus on the customer. And now I was talking to a colleague in Malaysia yesterday who was commenting that firstly after lockdown, all the shopping centres in Malaysia were crammed with people shopping. And I thought this is very curious, given what we know about the reluctance of people to go back into business as usual. To what extent do you think consumer behaviour will bounce back? I mean, Helen, you referred to this a little bit. You're concerned that it might not, following lifting of restrictions. Do you think that's actually going to be a practical expectation? What will firms have to do to encourage, if you like, it's spatial shopping rather than online shopping, if that's going to be their objective?
Shall I start? I mean, certainly retailers in the UK have been desperate for information about how those lifting of restrictions are panning out in different countries, because, as you say, it's a real unknown, and even those countries where the virus is further advanced, or the tail is, or they're more at a sort of lower level of cases. Every single country seems to have a slightly different story to tell. And so I think one thing which is absolutely, the consumer point of view is how confident individual people feel about the safety of different types of shopping. And I think that mindset is different depending on the culture and on the way that the messaging in that country has been delivered. From a sort of public discourse perspective. But I do think that, I got a text this morning from a homeware retailer, because homeware retailers could open in the UK over the last few weeks. And in the first few days of them opening, they had like-for-like sales growth in a socially distanced store on last year. And it's kind of like that is sort of contrary to everything that you might otherwise hear. But the sort of, I think the broader story is, particularly for the discretionary part of the industry, and I think we need to be careful that we're not sort of talking about different categories in the same way. So you take something like clothing, or well, clothing is a classic actually. Is, you know, that is, our reasons for buying clothes have almost been taken away from many of us from a short-term point of view. There's, you know, we're not going on holiday, we're not going out, we're not seeing our friends. So our desire to extend our wardrobe has been curtailed pretty significantly. So, and in those sectors, you know, there won't be that bounce back. I think it will take many months, and I think there is a question as to whether it will fully come back in total terms to what it was before, because actually I think the virus, the situation, I think, has taught many of us is to sort of reflect perhaps on what it is that is important to us all. And I think, you know, we've learned that digital connectivity, in whatever that means, whether it's with our friends, with what we buy, is a really sort of vital tenet. And it's reinforced, though, the importance of community. Yeah. And I think that's where physical retailing particularly comes in. And so if there was one thing I would say about the sort of the consumer perspective, I think it will be the importance of service in a socially distanced world is even more vital than it would have been. I mean, it was already there, but just perhaps not everybody was putting it perhaps so highly on their agenda. But I just think that, you know, that whether you call it experience or whether you call it service, just the importance of that connection, even if it might not be contactful, it might be contactless, is absolutely going to be part of the differentiator.
And this speaks to a point you raised, Alan, as well in your earlier remarks, and something we've talked about a lot about retailing, the need to be customer centric. How has customer centricity changed, and how will it change in terms of what customers are looking for? Do you agree with Helen that service is the defining element of this new form of centricity, or is it about feeling safe? How does that work?
I think it's almost certainly both of those things. The service point, I think, is really interesting, and I think that it does actually open up some interesting possibilities for retailers to create some rather different engagement models. I can envisage in some sectors, basic needs in particular, that products that we were buying relatively infrequently in physical stores, consumers may choose to buy on subscription, coffee pots or basic needs in the grocery cupboard. I could envisage a future which is work in progress amongst a lot of brands, where subscription morphs into treating a product rather more like a utility going into a home than it is a physical supply of goods going into a home. You know, internet-enabled washing machines that automatically replenish washing liquid going into the machine, where service actually takes the form of taking the shopper out of the process. I think that plays well for a shopper that is truly concerned, of course, as they must be, about their personal and their household safety. And service takes the form of not actually going into a store at all, in fact, not even seeking to procure one of those very scarce online delivery slots. So product becomes utility in that sense. But I can also certainly envisage a world where buying behavior changes enormously as consumer lifestyles are required to change enormously as a consequence of social distancing measures in particular. And it would appear logical to me that there's a tremendous vulnerability around those retailers whose business models have been predicated on a platform of very, very high transient traffic in very high traffic locations that allow them to afford extremely high rentals in those locations. I mean, airport retailing being an obvious case in point, but by no means the only case in point. Think small format grocery convenience stores in very busy, what used to be very busy urban areas. Think pre-prepared lunches, coffee shops. I think that those businesses are going to be very challenged now to look as to whether there is a sustainable model in a number of their outlets. And it wouldn't be entirely clear that the alternatives, putting product into supermarkets, moving to outbound delivery models, would allow those units, rather than businesses in their entirety, to continue to be profitable.
Yeah. I'm just picking up a couple of comments from the feed, and we've got viewers, I think, looking from Peru, Nepal, Nigeria, Portugal, Ukraine, Hong Kong, Greece. So clearly we need to ensure we're giving a very international dimension to our conversation. But Ugo from Nigeria is asking, apropos of your point about contactless and frictionless, what's your take on the rise of machine AI-controlled physical retail stores? So in other words, more Amazon Go type experiences. Does that also equate with service, do you think?
To me, yes, it does. And I think there has sometimes been a slight sense that those more, let's say, avant-garde technologies have been technology solutions, in a sense, looking for a problem to address. Well, now they have a problem to address. And Amazon, of course, has spoken ever since the Go stores were established that a lot of the technology content in those stores would be transferable to other of their physical retail operations, notably Whole Foods, of course, and indeed to other retail environments. And I think that is now going to be the case. So I can see added impetus being given to technologies that promote contactless. But I might also make the point that I think we've clearly seen amongst a lot of retailers how quickly they've been able to move operationally to put in place some very basic measures around traffic management, around queue management, around keeping frontline workers safe, with screens to shelter themselves from customers. So the solutions are not always expensive technology. They can be functional and executed very quickly as well.
Yeah. And Helen, I mean, just the sort of converse of that, you mentioned in your comments around the tendency we've seen in certain markets to support local retail businesses during lockdowns, perhaps inevitably, and I suppose the question around consumers is, to what extent do we think that loyalty will be sustained once restrictions are lifted? How loyal do you think shoppers will be to the smaller stores who are equally trying to put in place social distancing mechanisms, have much more limited capability for doing that, but for whom kind of service and knowledge of the local customer has become very important?
Yeah, and I think, it isn't size of business dependent. I think we as consumers are pretty fickle in our decision making, and therefore we will go to the places that deliver whatever our aspect of service is, and that may be, convenience, that may be information about how to use a new technology. It may be support in the decision-making process around what to buy. So I think the importance of locality, though, I think it has been and will continue to be reinforced because of what many people, I think, have recognised as if you've lost some of that connection to your local place, and that isn't just about retail, that's about leisure, that's about culture, that's about even other sort of flexible working environments, it's about care in the community. So I see that community aspects in its broadest sense, as opposed to just having a retail lens. And I think the answer to your question is it will be those businesses that can deliver what it is that I, as a customer, am looking for, and know their customer base well enough to be able to define that. And I think that's part of the problem that we've perhaps had in the lead up to all this is, there were so many people trying to do so many things. You can't answer everybody's question in every direction. You need to really know who your customers are and what it is that they want. What does service mean to them? Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely right. I think an interesting kind of twist on that is actually, can you be customer centric online? Lee from the UK asks that question. How do you create customer centricity online?
Oh, I think there's a compellingly strong case to say that you can be at least as customer centric online as you are offline. One of the challenges that the let's say more physical store-based retailers have often felt they face is an inherent data disadvantage compared to the online retailers. I think it's a little bit questionable whether it's an inherent disadvantage, but that's perhaps a topic for another day. But the point being that for the online retailers, those that are able to mine insights into how their customers are traveling around their website, traveling around their merchandise assortment, as well as their historic purchase behavior, and of course pull in other insights of how they're traveling in other parts of their digital world, allows a smart joined up retailer to be extremely customer centric in the promotions that they put forward, in the purchase suggestions that they make, and also the fulfillment part is a critical part of being customer centric, and presenting effective and safe fulfillment options, I think, is a key realizable opportunity as well.
Mm. And I'm going to ask one more question on the consumer side before we move on to a second topic. And this is from Shati from the US, who asks, do you think buyers will shift to more thoughtful and quality spending in the future? So moving away from cheap hyper-consumerism?
I think that's a great question. I think we don't know. I mean, the importance of ethics and impact on the wider environment, on the carbon usage, of all, I think, been themes up until, again, it's almost like pre-virus and post-virus. And I think I think this is an example where the thinking at the moment is that that is a trend that is likely to continue. But I guess, as Alan said, we are all in sort of uncharted territory, and I hope that the power of sort of purpose-driven businesses and the importance of considering your wider social, environmental impact beyond your business impact will be a consequence. But I'm sort of hesitating to say that I know that it will, because I'm not sure at this point, and we might think so now, but I really wouldn't like to call it, to be honest.
Could I add a little? Because if I think about the pandemic as a economic catastrophe, as well as being a health catastrophe, I think one thing we know about economic catastrophes, I'm thinking back to the global financial crisis as the most recent global event. We know that consumers come out of those events as different people to the way that they went into those events, that their buying behaviors do change. To the interesting question that was asked, I find myself a little like you, Helen. It's very difficult to call. I think that some consumers were already very conscious about their the environmental impact of their purchases and the sustainability of their behaviours, and I think those consumers will continue to be, and very possibly more so. But I think it's perhaps worth making the observation as well that we are entering a period of very challenging economic headwinds, and there will be a lot of consumers that are extremely value-conscious consumers, and they will be very orientated to price. They will be delaying non-essential purchases. You look at the momentum that was given to the value retailers in clothing and in food in a lot of geographies as a consequence of the global financial crisis. And I think it isn't difficult to imagine similar impetus being given to more value-orientated retailers in some geographies and in some sectors of retail. And that isn't inconsistent with being much more responsible in your buying behaviours in other parts of your purchase decision making. It's rather saying that consumers behave in different ways as individuals and in different parts of their spend.
And just one minor sort of build on Alan's point. I think we need to be cautious and not sort of think of value and sustainability as kind of two separate sides of an equation, because it's, you know, I think the sustainability debate almost needs to shift to one about, you know, just doing better business, whatever type of business it is. So they're not. You can still be a value retailer and operate in a sustainable way.
Absolutely.
As well as, you know, the other end of the spectrum. So it's it's our businesses asking themselves that question, and our consumers actually changing their shopping decisions as opposed to just caring about something. Are they actually moving from caring to actually acting? And that was the pivot that we were sort of on in the lead up to all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really good point. Let's shift, if we may, to you mentioned business, to the nature of viability of future business models in this next normal, or whatever we're going to call it. And we touched on this a little bit earlier on. How will retailers kind of square the circle, store-based retailers particularly, in being able to trade profitably under social distancing guidelines for some time to come? I was looking at a piece in the London Times today talking about the impossibility of 2 meters distancing for 80% of pubs and restaurants, for example. So are we likely to see the growth of kind of zombie retail firms as they kind of businesses restart, but are unable to trade sustainably profitably with the store networks that they have, and so will ultimately fail or have to shrink their networks despite that initial reopening?
I mean, they were all. You could, again, it comes back to the sort of pre and it's not even post, because we're not even entering in post. We're just entering into the next phase. But I think, you know, and different markets are different. So I appreciate this. You know, we've got an international audience, so this is a very UK perspective. But in the UK, as in probably many developed countries, we have too much retail space. We had too much retail space at the beginning of March, and I think what this has done is just say, you know, if you didn't believe it before, you better believe it now, and really how quickly we can restructure that space either into different uses, or from a retail point of view where there will be less retail, making it economic for retail to be able to sustain, you know, a proper business out of that space, will depend on the property structures, you know, the relationships between tenants and landlords in different countries, the role of local and central government in each of those countries. And certainly here, you know, we don't have a very efficient property system at all, in that, you know, we've got quite a lot of long leases. A lot of them have upward only rent reviews. And actually what does need to happen now is that those relationships do need to be restructured, because without that, we will see a swathe of I think Alan called it sort of bankruptcy, different types of bankruptcy. So accompanied voluntary liquidations here in the UK, administrations, and just because certain businesses will be left with no alternative other than to put themselves through that process, rather than to be able to really build themselves into a full sort of digitally and physically multi-channel, whatever words we want to use, connected business.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Berenek from Prague actually confirmed, sort of was asking that very same question. Will retailers need the same number of stores? I think we sort of suggested they won't. Could turnover rent only be the future? And I think we're kind of hinting for those markets that are already present. That's certainly.
I think there are some initiatives that retailers can take, are already talking about, already have taken to manage this question of operating. And Helen is absolutely right, not in a post-COVID world, in a world that has COVID-19. And I'm interested in retailers talking to me, talking to others about moving towards more appointment type models, which I think it can work in some sectors. I think it probably lends itself more to relatively infrequently purchased, relatively higher value purchases. I could see it working in in automotive. I think that may be an answer. For some, I think that for others, consumers are going to need to, in their physical worlds, be used to queuing rather more than they've traditionally done in the past. The one in, one out model in the local and smaller stores that we were talking about earlier, that may be an effective solution. I think for some retailers, we've touched on this, moving to more distributed outbound delivery models, so the customer isn't purely coming into the store. And it seems to me that the answers will be of how to accommodate a socially distanced COVID-19 world will be different for different sectors and for different store types. And I'm very certain that there isn't going to be a single silver bullet. I think the answer will be a multitude of different initiatives. But I think to the other sort of part of your question, Jonathan, of well, what can retailers do to persuade customers to visit their stores? Well, I think it will be around reassuring them, firstly, that it is safe to visit their stores, and then it will be all the other aspects that we're familiar with to do with value and price and service and so on.
I think safety will be, wasn't it Maslow's hierarchy? It's a hygiene factor. It will, I think people, whether it's employees or whether it's customers, have to have that sense of safety. And I think that's the real difficult part of where we are at the moment, particularly from a business model or even an immediate operational point of view. You mentioned the 2 meter rule. It's not even 2 meters in lots of other countries. Yeah. It might be 1 meter. I can't remember but it's 1 meter, it's 1.5 meters, it's 2 meters.
Yeah. So there's a whole variety of sort of scientific advice that's being used to determine the likely sustainability of certain retail business models for bricks and mortar retailers, which is a little, it's very varied advice in some instances.
Yeah.
But it does come back to the health and the science in the end. Let's deal with the online piece. We've got a comment here from Kurt from the UK, which I think is an opinion, not necessarily a view we might all share, but online retail will end up being dominated by global businesses such as Amazon, pushing out SMEs, keeping wages low, avoiding paying full UK taxes, and procuring outside of the UK as a statement. But it does kind of make us want to consider what it's become commonplace amongst the commentators to assume that online will grow, will be sustained. And yet I queued up for an hour just to try it out on a home improvement DIY website last weekend, just to get onto the website, let alone to buy anything once I got to the website. So do we have some kind of some challenges in scaling to deal with the potential demand, if that demand is going to be sustained over the next few months as learn how to use online? What does that do to, again, the acceleration of the move towards more genuinely omni-channel retailing activity in the ecosystem?
I think maybe if I can start, it's a very interesting, important territory. And I think it is well worth reflecting that different countries are at very, very different stages in their online journeys, if I can put it that way. And I think that what is working in some geographies is not working in others. The almost uniquely joined up digital economies of the Far East in particular are very different stages of their development to the Western economies that have gone through different stages of retail development. But to your question, I continue to be sort of more impressed by the ability of retailers to change their operations in very short order to their very different operating environments over the last couple of months. It can feel like a lifetime ago, but for most of us on this webinar, it's between 8 and 10 weeks that we went into this very different world. And I'm rather more impressed with the ability of retailers to transform their operations very quickly, either in response to catastrophic collapses in demand or in response to accelerated increases in demand to quite unprecedented levels, then I am critical of the sector for its slowness to respond to different operating environment. But I think as well that it's very difficult for me to foresee a future in any geography that I'd be familiar with that doesn't have a much higher level of sustained demand for online retailing. I doubt that it will stay at the levels that it remains at in most subsectors of retail during the lockdown. But I find it difficult to imagine that it will drop back to the levels that that we saw pre these lockdowns.
And is that because people are now more familiar with using it, that non-users have now had to use it and therefore more familiar? Or is there something more kind of strategic going on here by firms?
I think it's several things, Jonathan. I think, again, the safety point to me looms very large. And Helen's quite right to make this distinction between basic need shopping and more comparison, non-essential shopping. But I think in the basic needs space, I feel that I'm seeing a lot of consumers that are making a very deliberate decision that it's safer as well as more convenient to migrate a lot of their basic needs shopping online, which is why I suggest as well that I think that we could see some very different and very interesting business opportunities arising out of that, which is somewhat of a step beyond purely booking your online order. But the one thing I would caution to be alert to is it's not necessarily the case that traditional retailers are best placed to realise that opportunity. And I mentioned that point that before our worlds changed, of course, the big global brand owners were very active in developing direct-to-consumer channels. The technology companies have been very active in developing direct-to-consumer businesses, and a lot of the innovation in the retail sector has been by those incursive new entrants, which leads me to the view it isn't necessarily the case that retailers are best equipped to realise these opportunities.
Just to put some data from at least one market into that. So online penetration, so the proportion of retail sales that were online back in 2006 in the UK was less than 3%. Last year it was around 20%, so £1 in £5 in the UK spent online. And the growth rate last year of online had really slowed. So it was sort of between 5 and 10% year on year. Over the last 8 weeks, so in particularly the last sort of 3 or 4, online in the UK is up 50%, 50 year on year. So I think this plays to Alan's point that, you know, and if you imagine, you know, every warehouse in the country, every logistics company are operating in a kind of new way, back to the sort of social distancing and safety perspective. That is a huge amount of capacity that has shifted from one channel to another, and there's still a big hole in the middle because it hasn't made up for the gap. But how much that? So I think that will fall back, but I just don't think it will fall back to the pre-crisis levels. And I do think also, picking up on Alan's other point, is this, you know, what is retail anyway? The whole blurring of the lines between, you know, the traditional ways that we might have defined a retail business that, you know, really traditionally used to be a shop. Then it was sort of a shop that might have had a website. Now we have pure plays. We have direct to consumer. We have platforms. We have independent businesses on those platforms, as well as the platforms themselves being sellers. So the whole the landscape of you know, where the profit, so back to the economics of it, where the profits can be made, what the business model is that will actually, you know, sustain some shareholders somewhere, I think has just got, even before all of this, even more complicated. And I think or more, not more complicated, but more competitive. And therefore, all the virus that the last few weeks has done is just accelerate that level of competitiveness, even make it even more intense than it was before.
Yeah. We've got about 10 minutes left of the session. It's gone very quickly, but before we talk about the implications for leaders, I wanted to ask a question that builds on your comment about sustainable businesses, Helen, because at the moment, certainly in the UK and elsewhere, many retail businesses are being sustained by government, with the furloughing schemes and so on for jobs, for liquidity and so on. Once lockdowns start to be released, how far do you think government support will still be required for the sector? And you're in this role in seeking to influence government. I mean, you were at the number 10 press conference a few weeks ago with a retail voice there. How should retailers seek to work with government during these next few weeks and months?
Well, of course, as the chief executive of a trade association, I should say they should coordinate with their trade association to ensure that what the need to change a lot of regulation very, very quickly has highlighted is the importance of having that collective voice. So whatever the mechanism is, whether it is a trade association, so I think that the first thing is you've got to have good communication channels, because otherwise you can't even have the dialogue. And I think, while what the UK government and so many governments have done has been, much overused word at the moment, but unprecedented in terms of the type of support, I do think that governments are not business people; they're governments. And they really need to, I think, how this is going to play out and the implications of some of the sort of systemic and structural things that we've been touching on, we've really got a job to do to help them get their head around that, because I think a lot of governments will think they've done the support, they've put the furlough scheme in place, they've made some liquidity available, tick, tick, done. And actually, we are only at the beginning of what and how this might all shake out, because it's not going to be business as usual. We're not going to, back to the point about, it's not a tap that was turned off and we're just turning it back on. It just won't be like that.
It's a marathon rather than a sprint argument.
Yeah.
This actually links to something made by UK question here, which is how can we invigorate the average UK high street with the decline of physical retail, which is clearly linked to the extent to which governments can support that, as they are in the UK with various funding initiatives and so on. But the role of the public sector, both locally and nationally, in supporting the evolution of downtowns and high streets. Again, Helen, can I just quickly turn to you before we move on to leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, in terms of the evolution of high streets, we need to think beyond retail. So retail and high streets are not just retail. High streets are a sort of community and place. So we need to really have a consistent vision of what that future could and should look like around how we use our leisure time in our local area, how we educate ourselves locally, how we perhaps work more flexibly with less traveling around the country in our local community, the importance of an aging population and care in the community. I mean, the sort of spotlight that we've had on social care has been so huge over the last few weeks. So I think we need to really align behind a different future that it wasn't the same as the past. And then, as you say, we absolutely have to get local leadership from local government as a sort of pivotal point, but bringing together, whether it's retail businesses or leisure businesses, or all of those sort of stakeholders that I've mentioned to be able to, get from A to B and move the barriers that sit in between, some of which are levers that central governments have, some of which are levers that are at a local level. Yeah. But the idea that we'll have a sort of one size fits all, I think is not the way we should be thinking about it. I think we just need to have a sort of consistent vision that we're not trying to save something, we're trying to transform to something different. And there has got to be local leadership in creating that thing, because every place is going to be unique and has a different set of reasons as to why people want to not just shop there, but spend time there.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, all the things we've been saying so far, a bit about the landscape of future retailing, the stakeholders, and so on. The final thing I want to talk about in the last 5 or 6 minutes or so, and really it deserves much longer than that, is really the implications for retail leaders. And perhaps I could ask you first, Alan, what kind of leaders will retailing post-COVID require, do you think? What sort of skills and capabilities will they need that are different from previously?
Yes, if I keep my comments to a headline level, Jonathan, in the interest of time, these are profoundly challenging times for the retail industry. I think we can genuinely say that they are uniquely challenging times for the retail industry, which puts such an onus on retail business leaders to show genuine leadership. And when I think globally of people that I've worked with and people that I've had the pleasure to interact with, I do think that the retail industry is blessed with some very talented people and some very impressive leaders. What type of people? I think the type of people that retail enterprises need, large or small, irrespective of subsector or geography, are leaders that truly understand what it means to be customer-centric, whether that's at the level of an individual store or a large global retail enterprise. Understand what it means to be truly customer-centric, are agile and willing to move at pace to transform their organizations from what it is today to what it needs to be fit for purpose in this very different world. I think it needs business leaders and it needs enterprises that are resilient, and resilience in leadership, resilience in leadership teams, resilience in value chains, resilience on balance sheets is an area that would have merited a webinar in its own right, in my view. And I think also, Jonathan, they are leaders and their teams of people that behave with integrity, because one would like to believe that one of the positive consequences of the period that we are, and Helen is quite right, that we are in the early stages of being in, is that we look to our leaders, whether they're in communities, whether they're in government, or whether they're in business, to behave with integrity. And I would like to think that the retailers that will be successful in this very changed world will be the ones that have demonstrated that they've behaved with integrity to their suppliers, to their communities, to their staff, as well as to their customers. So it's a challenging it's a challenging environment, and I think that it's a challenging set of skills that teams of leaders need to be able to demonstrate.
Helen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Alan completely. I mean, I think the retail is, at the end of the day, it's a people business. People are at the heart of any successful retailer. And I mean, we at the BRC, we set up a BRC Learning about a year and a half ago, in recognition of this need to evolve leadership capability and skills right across the industry. And if just to pick some words to reinforce what Alan said, I mean, adaptability, resilience, empowered leadership, a digital perspective. These are all the sort of skill sets that sit around an underlying importance of culture and purpose. And I think without that sense of purpose and the right culture within any business, no matter how resilient an individual leader might be, or how adaptable they might be, then you can't shift the whether it's a tanker or a small ship, but you've got to get everybody facing in the different in different direction, in the same direction. And I think times like this just reinforce the need to be able to do that, and those that are going to be successful coming out of it are the ones that will show that they have been able to achieve that in some pretty challenging circumstances.
Yeah, good. Well, listen, both of you, thank you so much for a really rich set of contributions and conversation over the last hour. As you both said, we could have spent a lot longer unpacking some of these ideas and elaborating them a lot more. I hope the audience that has been listening to us over the last hour, we've tackled some of your questions. We didn't have time to tackle all of them. I think there's a few still on the chat here that we'll try and get to offline. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Alan and to Helen in particular for your wisdom and your commentary. If I could just do a bit more selfless promotion, next Tuesday is our next Leading in Extraordinary Times seminar. It's on the future of advertising, and it's led by my colleague, Professor Andrew Stephen, with guests from Facebook, Twitter, and WPP. So that's at 1400 hours BST next Tuesday. If you'd care to join that, I highly recommend it, because Andrew is doing some really excellent and extraordinary work himself in this field. So without any further ado, thank you again to Helen and Alan. Thank you for comments from the audience. I hope you've enjoyed the last hour, and keep in touch and stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.